Welcome back, guys, to Wrong Turn Horror. In today's episode, I'm sharing 10 true Appalachian nightmares you'll never forget. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you never miss a new horror story. Now, let's dive into the first nightmare, the vanishing on Clingman's Dome. There's something about the Appalachian Mountains that swallows sound. Hikers often describe it. The way the wind curls around ridges, how the dense pines muffle even your own footsteps, and the way silence can stretch so long it feels alive. Clingman's Dome, the highest peak in the Smokies, is beautiful during the day, but when the fog rolls in, it becomes something else entirely. This story isn't a campfire tale or a hiker's exaggeration. It's a documented case, one locals still whisper about, and the details make it a nightmare no one has ever forgotten. The hiker. Back in the late summer of 1981, a man named Charlie Webb, an experienced outdoorsman from North Carolina, set out for a solo trip up Clingman's Dome. He wasn't reckless. He had hiked the Appalachian Trail several times before. He carried maps, a compass, and gear that his family said was borderline obsessive. Charlie wasn't the kind of man to get lost. But what makes this case so unsettling is not that he vanished. It's how. Witnesses confirmed that Charlie was seen at the Clingman's Dome parking lot around 7:30 in the morning. He chatted briefly with another hiker about the weather and joked about beating the fog that was predicted to roll in later that day. He strapped on his pack and started up the paved trail that leads to the observation tower. That was the last confirmed sighting of him alive. The search begins. When Charlie didn't return home the next day, his wife reported him missing. Rangers assumed maybe he had overextended his hike. But when he didn't come back by the following evening, the first official search began. What they found, or didn't find, is the root of this nightmare. The trail up to the dome is straightforward, paved, and heavily traveled. Rangers expected to find some trace, a dropped water bottle, a footprint in the mud, even scraps of gear. Instead, it was as if Charlie had stepped into the woods and evaporated. Search dogs were brought in, but the moment they reached a section just below the tower, the dogs began acting strangely. Some refused to go further. Others circled and whined, as though they sensed something that the humans couldn't. Volunteers combed the ridges, ravines, and dense thickets that stretched for miles in every direction. For days, helicopters scanned the canopy. Nothing. Not a shoe print. Not a torn piece of clothing. The disturbing report. On the sixth day, things took a darker turn. A pair of hikers, unaware of the missing person search, reported something eerie. They claimed that while camping near Andrews Bald, a meadow not far from Clingman's Dome, they heard footsteps circling their tent all night. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. At one point, one of them swore he saw the beam of a flashlight moving slowly between the trees. But when they called out, the light snapped off. The hikers assumed it was just a lost backpacker until, in the morning, they found no tracks around their tent at all. Just untouched grass soaked in dew. They only learned later about Charlie's disappearance and reported it to the Rangers. That's when old stories began resurfacing. The Cherokee people, who lived in these mountains long before settlers arrived, had legends of Sulkaloo, a giant, shadowy being who roamed the high ridges, guarding the mountains and punishing those who wandered too far in a sacred land. Locals whispered that maybe Charlie had angered something that wasn't meant to be disturbed. Others leaned on more sinister explanations. They said the mountains sometimes took people, not by accident, not by misstep, but by something hungry in the silence, something that knew how to erase every trace. Weeks passed. The official search was called off. Charlie's family, desperate for closure, continued to scour the mountains themselves. That's when reports of strange sightings began. A tourist hiking late in the fall claimed she saw a man standing just off the trail near the dome, watching her. She described him as tall, gaunt, with sunken eyes and a dirty pack slung over his shoulders. But when she blinked, he was gone. Another report came from a ranger who swore he saw movement in the fog near the observation tower one morning. He thought it was just another hiker, but when he called out, no one answered. What chilled him was the sound he swore followed, a faint, ragged breathing echoing in the mist. Family's last visit. Charlie's wife made one last pilgrimage to the site months later. She climbed the paved trail to the observation tower alone. She left a small cross and his favorite compass at the base of the railing, whispering a goodbye. What she didn't tell reporters, but admitted years later to her daughter, was that as she turned to leave, she heard something. A low, guttural whisper that seemed to curl through the fog. It said one word, her name. She ran down the trail without looking back. The case today. To this day, Charlie Webb has never been found. No bones, no gear, nothing. His disappearance is still open in Park Service records, labeled as unsolved. But hikers still tell stories. Some say if you climb Clingman's Dome on a foggy morning and stand completely still, you'll hear it. The crunch of unseen footsteps in the gravel behind you. If you turn, no one is there. If you stay too long, you might feel a breath at the back of your neck. Many hikers refuse to linger after dark. Locals advise against camping near the dome altogether, because up there, high above the Smokies, the silence doesn't just swallow sound. It listens, and sometimes it calls your name. Charlie Webb went into the Appalachian wilderness prepared for everything. But the mountains had something waiting that no compass, no map, no experience could save him from. And if you ever find yourself at Clingman's Dome when the fog rolls in, remember his story. Because the silence might already be watching you. Now, let's move on to the second Appalachian nightmare. This one isn't about a hiker, but about something buried deep under the mountains. Something the locals say has never really stopped moving. The mind that breathes at night. Coal runs in the veins of Appalachia. For generations, families depended on the mines, digging into the earth for black rock that powered the nation. But with that livelihood came danger, collapses, gas leaks, explosions, and the slow death of black lung. Every town has its stories, and some of them go beyond tragedy. In McDowell County, West Virginia, there's an old abandoned shaft the locals call the Holloway Mine. Officially, it was sealed in the late 1950s after a collapse killed 12 men. But if you ask the people who live nearby, the mine was never truly abandoned. They'll tell you that at night, when the air is still and the hills are quiet, you can hear it breathing. The Holloway collapse. The official records say the Holloway mine collapsed on a rainy spring morning. A buildup of methane gas triggered a cave-in that trapped 12 miners half a mile underground. Rescue crews worked tirelessly for days, drilling holes, pumping air, lowering microphones into the shafts, hoping to catch some sign of life. What unsettled them most wasn't the silence, but the sounds they did hear. One rescuer reported faint knocking that echoed through the tunnels. Another swore he heard men's voices calling from deep inside, muffled and distorted. Yet every time they broke through to a chamber, it was empty. After 8 days, the search was called off. Officially, all 12 men were declared dead. The entrances were sealed with concrete. Families mourned, the company moved on, and the Holloway mine was left to rot. But that was just the beginning. Within months, locals began reporting strange noises near the site. Farmers working at night claimed to hear the sound of picks striking rock long after the mine was abandoned. Children dared each other to sneak up to the sealed entrance, where they said you could hear heavy, labored breathing coming from behind the concrete. By the 1970s, the stories had grown darker. One teenager claimed he saw a light flickering inside the mine, as if a lantern swung slowly in the dark. Another swore he heard men whispering his name through the cracks in the rock. Nobody stayed long enough to check. The trespassers. The most infamous incident happened in 1983, when 3 teenagers from Welch decided to prove the legends wrong. They hiked up to the Holloway site one night with crowbars and flashlights, determined to break through the rusted fence and slip inside. They managed to crack open one of the concrete seals covering a ventilation shaft. The opening was barely wide enough for them to squeeze through, but 2 of them did. The third stayed behind his lookout. Minutes passed, then an hour. The boy waiting outside grew restless. That's when he heard it, breathing, deep, ragged, inhumanly slow. It seemed to echo up from the shaft, vibrating the ground beneath him. He called for his friends, but there was no answer. Just the sound of rocks shifting and something wet dragging against stone. Terrified, he ran for help. By the time police and locals returned, the shaft was silent. The two boys inside were never found. Over the years, Holloway Mine has become a ghost story parents tell to keep their kids away. But some families insist it's more than a story. Old miners speak in hushed tones about how the earth sometimes keeps what's given to it. They talk about the spirits of men who died deep underground. Men whose lungs filled with dust, whose voices were stolen by the rock. Others whisper about something older, something not human at all. The Cherokee once warned settlers not to dig too deep in certain ridges. They believed the mountains themselves were alive, that beneath the stone was a great, sleeping thing that could inhale and exhale, shifting the ground above. And in McDowell County, some believe the Holloway Mine broke into that thing's resting place. The last sighting, the most recent report, came in 2014. A group of amateur explorers, urban spelunkers, decided to document the Holloway Mine for a YouTube channel. They brought cameras, lights, and gear to break into one of the sealed entrances. The video, which was briefly uploaded before being taken down, begins with the group laughing and joking as they pry loose rusted metal bars. The footage cuts in and out as they descend into darkness. Halfway through, one of them asks, "Do you hear that?" The audio grows distorted, but you can make out something long, slow, rhythmic sounds like lungs inhaling and exhaling through stone. The video ends abruptly when one of the explorers screams. The camera hits the ground, and the last frame shows dust swirling in the beam of a flashlight. Dust moving as though drawn by a powerful breath. The channel that posted it went silent. The video vanished, and the people behind it never uploaded again. The Holloway Mine is fenced off, forgotten by most. But the locals don't go near it. They say if you stand too close after dark, the air feels wrong, thick, damp, like something huge is stirring beneath the earth. Some claim the mine isn't abandoned at all, that those 12 men never really died, that they're still down there, half buried, lungs filling and emptying in unison with the breathing mountain. And others say it isn't the men you hear at all. It's the mountain itself, alive, waiting, hungry. Now, let's move to the third nightmare. This one is about a stretch of land where the mountains don't just swallow the light, they swallow people. A place where dozens have gone in, but only silence has come back out. The Appalachian Hollow, where people go missing. Appalachia is filled with hollows, narrow valleys carved between ridges, where houses cling to the slopes and fog rolls in thick as smoke. But one hollow in eastern Kentucky has a reputation unlike any other. Locals call it Mason Hollow, though if you ask around, most people will lower their voices when they say the name. The reason is simple. People go missing there. Not once, not twice, but again and again for over a century. Hunters, hikers, loggers, even children play near the tree line. They vanish without a trace, as though the hollow itself has the power to erase them from the earth. The earliest known case goes back to 1897. A farmer named Elijah Mason, whose family gave the hollow its name, sent his 12-year-old son to gather firewood. The boy never returned. Search parties combed the ridge for weeks. Bloodhounds were brought in. They found nothing, not even a scrap of clothing. Elijah swore he heard his son's voice calling at night, echoing through the hollow. But every time he followed the sound, it led him deeper into the woods, until he realized he was being led in circles. He came back pale, shaking, and refused to enter the hollow again. The pattern. After that, the disappearances came slowly but steadily. A logger in 1912, a hunter in 1924, a girl walking home from school in 1936. Each one entered the hollow and never came out. During World War II, 2 brothers went missing while rabbit hunting. Locals searched for days and eventually found one of their rifles leaning neatly against a tree, as if it had been placed there deliberately. No footprints, no struggle, just the weapon left behind, untouched. By the 1960s, the hollow had earned its cursed reputation. Parents warned their children not to wander near it. Hunters refused to track deer into its boundaries. Yet, despite the warnings, people kept disappearing. One of the strangest cases happened in 1978. A college student from Lexington named Daniel Cooper set out to hike and camp in Mason Hollow, determined to prove the old stories were just superstition. When he failed to return, authorities launched a search. After 3 days, they found his tent. Inside was his journal. The entry started off casual. Notes about the landscape, sketches of trees and birds. But as the days went on, the handwriting grew shaky. I hear someone walking outside the tent at night. Thought it was a deer, but the steps are too heavy. They stop whenever I unzip the flap. There's something wrong with the trees here. They look normal during the day, but when the wind blows at night, they lean toward the tent like they're listening. Last night, I heard my mother's voice. She was calling for me, telling me to come deeper into the hollow. But my mother is 200 miles away. The final entry was a single sentence, scrawled across the page. The hollow doesn't want me to leave. Daniel Cooper was never found. The 1992 family vanishing. The case that cemented Mason Hollow's reputation came in the summer of 1992. A family of 4 from Ohio, parents and 2 children, were driving through eastern Kentucky on vacation. They stopped near the hollow to have a picnic. They were never seen again. Their car was discovered parked neatly along a gravel turnout. Their picnic basket was still on the blanket, sandwiches half-eaten, drinks unopened. It looked as if they had simply stood up mid-meal and walked into the woods. Searchers covered every inch of the hollow for weeks. The only clue they found was a camera belonging to the father, lodged between 2 rocks in a creek bed. The film inside was water-damaged, but a few photographs were recoverable. The first images were ordinary, family smiling, children playing. But the last 2 were different. One showed the tree line of Mason Hollow at dusk, the forest unnaturally dark, as if swallowing the fading light. The final picture was blurry, almost unintelligible. But investigators swore it showed several figures standing between the trees, tall, thin, featureless shadows, watching. The Cherokee once told stories about certain places in the mountains, thin places where the barrier between worlds was weaker. Mason Hollow, some believe, is one of them. Old-timers in Kentucky say the hollow is hungry, that the land itself takes people, drawing them deeper and deeper until they can't find their way out. Others believe there's something living there, an ancient spirit, or maybe several, that lures victims with voices of loved ones, tricking them into the trees. The strangest part is how many witnesses report the same thing, hearing someone they know calling their name from inside the hollow, even when that person is miles away. In 2005, a retired sheriff from Breathitt County spoke about Mason Hollow in an interview. He said he'd worked on 3 separate missing person cases tied to the area, and every one of them left him uneasy. What haunted him most was something that happened during a search in the late 90s. He and 2 deputies were combing a ridge when they heard a child crying deep in the trees. They followed the sound for nearly an hour. Every time they thought they were getting closer, the crying moved farther away. Finally, they reached a clearing they didn't recognize. There in the dirt were dozens of shoe prints. Children's shoe prints. Some fresh, some so old they had half faded into the ground. But there were no children, and the crying had stopped. The sheriff never went back to Mason Hollow. Why it terrifies locals. Today, Mason Hollow is avoided. Hikers get a wide berth. Hunters refuse to track game into its boundaries. Locals warn outsiders, but many ignore them, drawn in by curiosity or the thrill of chasing a legend. So make it back out, but some don't. What makes it so terrifying isn't just the number of disappearances, it's the silence that follows. No bodies, no evidence, just lives erased, families left with questions, and the suffocating sense that the land itself has chosen to take them. If you ever find yourself near eastern Kentucky and someone points out the tree line of Mason Hollow, remember this. Not everyone who walks into that valley comes back. And if you hear a voice calling your name from the woods, no matter how familiar it sounds, don't answer. Deep in the coal-stained mountains of Kentucky, there's a hollow that locals refuse to name after dark. It sits just outside Harlan County, a stretch of land where the trees lean too close together, the air hangs too heavy, and the silence itself feels like it's pressing against your chest. Most people in town know the stories, passed down in whispers at diners and front porches. Stories about miners who never came home, hunters who wandered in but were never seen again, and screams that echo on fog-drenched nights. They call it simply the Hollow. No one needs to ask which one. Everyone already knows. And this story begins with a young man named Caleb Turner, who in 1998 decided he didn't believe in curses. Caleb had just turned 21. He was the kind of kid who thought he was too smart for small-town superstitions. He laughed at ghost stories, mocked the elders who left offerings of whiskey or tobacco at the edge of the hollow, and told his friends he was going to prove once and for all that the place was nothing but woods. One October night, after a few too many beers, Caleb made good on his promise. He grabbed a flashlight, a backpack, and his hunting rifle, and told his friends, "If I don't come back, then maybe I'll be the ghost you're all so scared of." They tried to stop him, but you know how pride works when you're young. Caleb disappeared into the tree line with a cocky grin. The last words anyone heard him say were, "See you in the morning." The morning came. Caleb didn't. By noon, a search party had gathered. At first, it felt like a routine rescue. Just a kid who got drunk, wandered too far, and probably fell asleep under a tree. But when the hounds were released, something strange happened. They refused to go forward. These were seasoned hunting dogs, trained to track bears. But as soon as they reached the hollow's entrance, they whined, tucked their tails, and backed away. One of the handlers muttered, "They can smell it." When asked what he meant, he didn't answer. The search went on without them. For hours, volunteers combed the underbrush, calling Caleb's name. By sunset, they found the first sign: his backpack, shredded open, straps torn like something with claws had raked across it. His flashlight lay nearby, the bulb smashed as if it had been stomped underfoot. But there was no blood, no trail, no body, just silence. And then the screaming began. Several searchers swore they heard it at the same time. A man's voice, distant, echoing between the trees. "Help me." It was faint but clear, desperate and ragged. They shouted back, but the cries didn't move closer. They stayed in one spot, looping again and again, always sounding the same. One older man in the group, a retired miner named Jack Sloan, turned pale and muttered, "That ain't him." They asked what he meant, but Jack refused to answer. Instead, he dropped his lantern and walked straight out of the woods, shaking his head. He never returned to the hollow again. The search continued for 3 days. Each night, some of the volunteers reported the same thing, the screaming. Always the same tone, the same words, as if something deep in the woods was pretending to be Caleb. By the 4th day, the sheriff called it off. "He wandered off drunk, probably fell in a shaft," he said. "We're not risking more lives." But Caleb's mother swore she could hear her son crying outside her window at night for weeks afterward. Years passed. People moved on, but the hollow did not forget. In 2005, a pair of hikers from out of state went missing on that same ridge. Their tent was found shredded. Their supplies were scattered. No blood, no footprints, no bodies, just the same eerie silence. Locals began to share a theory, whispers of something that lived in the hollow, something old and angry. Some said it was a creature left behind when the mines were dug too deep, something that feasted on men's fear. Others claimed it was the spirits of miners who had died in the 1920s collapse, trapped and twisted into something unholy. But the most chilling theory? That the hollow didn't take people at random. It kept them. One hunter swore that while tracking deer near the hollow, he saw a figure in the distance, tall, pale, and human-shaped. It staggered between the trees, wearing what looked like torn jeans and a flannel shirt. He raised his rifle, thinking it was a lost hiker. But when the figure turned its head, its face was wrong. The skin hung too loose. The mouth stretched too wide. And the eyes were pure black, like coal pulled straight from the earth. The hunter fled and never went back. But when he told the sheriff, he swore on his life the thing was wearing the same clothes Caleb Turner had worn the night he disappeared. Today, people still avoid the hollow. Truckers driving past at night say their CB radios sometimes pick up voices calling for help, even though no one is transmitting. Campers claim they've heard screams drifting down from the ridge, always the same, always repeating. And every few years, someone new goes missing. A drifter, a hunter, a local who thought the stories were just tales told to keep kids from wandering too far. But ask the old-timers in Harlan County, and they'll tell you the truth. The hollow is hungry. It always has been. It always will be. They'll tell you to never walk too close to its trees, never follow voices you hear in the dark, and never, ever, answer if someone calls your name from the woods. Because if you do, you might just end up like Caleb Turner, still screaming, even 25 years later, for help that will never come. And maybe, if you ever find yourself driving through Harlan County at night, you'll hear it too. That same voice. Faint, ragged, repeating, "Help me." But by then, it'll be too late. That was the cursed hollow of Harlan County. Tell me, if you heard a voice in the woods calling your name, would you follow it, or would you run? Until next time, don't take the wrong turn. Coal runs through the veins of Appalachia like blood through an artery. For more than a century, men have gone into the mountains with pickaxes and dynamite, carving tunnels deep into the black earth, searching for the coal that powered America. But coal mining isn't just about backbreaking work. It's about death. Caves that collapse without warning. Methane explosions that burn men alive. And something else, something the miners never talk about above ground. The shadow. Not a superstition, not a ghost story told to scare children. At least, not to the miners. To them, the shadow is real. They call it the last thing you see when you're about to die underground. And this story is about one man who learned the truth. His name was Earl McKinney, a miner in Logan County, West Virginia, back in 1973. He was a veteran of the mines, a tough man with calloused hands and coal dust lungs. Earl didn't scare easily, but even he had heard the whispers, the ones passed around at the company bar on Friday nights. Miners would say, "If you see the shadow, boy, don't bother running. It already owns you." Some swore it was the spirit of men who had been buried alive in collapses. Others claimed it was the devil himself, drawn to the mines because hell wanted its coal back. Earl didn't believe any of it, until one night in November. It was the midnight shift, and Earl was working deep in the No. 9 mine. The air was heavy with coal dust, the kind that sticks to your teeth. His helmet light flickered as he swung his pick, chipping away at the wall. That's when he noticed it. At first, he thought it was just the play of light against stone. But then his stomach turned cold. On the wall in front of him, a shadow stretched long and thin. But it wasn't his. His lamp was pointing the wrong way. The shadow stood tall, shoulders slumped forward, arms too long. It looked almost human, except its head bent at a strange angle, like a man whose neck had been broken. And though Earl was standing perfectly still, the shadow moved. It raised one arm, slowly, deliberately, and it pointed straight at him. Earl staggered back, his pick clattering against the stone. His lamp sputtered, then flared bright again. When the light steadied, the shadow was gone. He told himself it was just exhaustion, just a trick of his mind. But deep down, he knew better. That night, he went home and told his wife, Clara. She crossed herself and begged him not to go back. "Earl, you've seen the shadow," she whispered. "Men don't come back from that. But miners don't get quit. Not in Logan County. If Earl didn't show up, his family wouldn't eat." So the next night, he went back underground. That's when the accidents began. On the second night, the roof caved in 3 tunnels over. 2 men were crushed instantly. On the third night, a methane pocket exploded, burning another crew alive. Earl wasn't near either disaster, but each time, he swore he saw the shadow standing in the distance, just out of the light, watching. By the 4th night, Earl's nerves were shot. His hands shook. He barely slept. Clara begged him again not to return. But he kept going, because coal doesn't care if you're scared. Coal only cares if you dig. And that night, the shadow finally came for him. Earl was alone in his section of the tunnel, chipping away at a vein of coal. The air grew colder, unnaturally so. His breath fogged in front of him, though there was no draft. And then he heard it, a voice. At first it was faint, like the echo of someone working farther down. But the words became clear. A man's voice, raspy, broken. "Get out." Earl froze. He called out, thinking it was another miner. But no one answered. The tunnel was empty. Then the shadow appeared again, on the wall, larger this time, closer. Its arms dangled almost to the ground, its fingers stretched into claws. Its head lolled from side to side like it was listening, and then it stepped off the wall. Earl dropped his pick and ran. His boots slipped on the wet stone as he scrambled through the tunnel, helmet light bouncing wildly. Behind him, he heard something following. Heavy steps, slow, deliberate. The deeper he ran, the more the tunnels seemed to twist, unfamiliar, as if the mine itself was shifting to keep him trapped. He swore he could hear breathing, ragged and wet, just inches behind his neck. Finally, he burst into a larger chamber where two other miners were working. They looked up in shock as Earl staggered in, gasping, eyes wide with terror. "There's something down here," he screamed. But when they shone their lamps into the tunnel behind him, there was nothing, just darkness. Earl refused to go back after that. He quit the mines, even though it meant poverty. The company blacklisted him, called him unstable, a coward. But he didn't care, because the shadow didn't just stay in the mine. He saw it again 2 weeks later, standing across the street from his house. A tall, broken figure in the lamplight, watching, waiting. His wife swore she saw it too. One night she screamed, saying a shape was standing in the corner of their bedroom. But when Earl lit a lantern, nothing was there. The haunting continued for months. Earl wasted away, jumping at every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of candlelight. His neighbors said he looked hollow-eyed, like he hadn't slept in weeks. And then, one morning in March, Clara found him. Earl was sitting in his chair, staring at the wall. His skin was pale, his body rigid. His mouth hung open in a silent scream. And behind him, burned into the wall like soot, was the shadow. To this day, old miners in Logan County tell the story of Earl McKinney. They say the shadow is still down there, waiting in the mines. Some claim it follows certain families, clinging to their bloodline like a curse. Others say it's not one spirit at all, but many. Every miner who ever died underground, fused together into something hungry. But whatever it is, there's one thing they all agree on. If you see the shadow in the mines, your time is up. It doesn't matter if you quit. It doesn't matter if you run. It will find you. So the next time you drive through West Virginia and pass an old coal shaft, remember, those tunnels go deeper than you think, deeper than the earth, deeper than hell itself. And if you ever find yourself underground, helmet light flickering, and you see a shadow that doesn't belong to you, don't bother running. Because the coal miner shadow is already standing right behind you. That was the coal miner's shadow. Tell me, if you worked underground, could you ignore the stories? Or would you wonder, every time you turned off your light, if something else was standing there with you? Until next time, don't take the wrong turn. The Appalachians are full of whispers, old wives' tales, ghost stories, and warnings carved into the bones of the mountains. But one of the oldest legends doesn't involve ghosts or miners or creatures in the woods. It involves witches. Now, when most people hear that word, they think of broomsticks and black cats. But in the back hollers of Kentucky, Tennessee, and West Virginia, witchcraft isn't some fairy tale. It's blood, sweat, and curses that cling to families for generations. And sometimes, it leaves a mark. This story begins in Clay County, Kentucky, in 1985. A young man named Darren Willis had just bought a plot of land deep in the Appalachian woods. Darren wasn't a local. He was from Lexington, a city boy who thought he could escape the noise and settle into the quiet country life. The locals warned him, though. His land backed right up to the ruins of an old homestead, the crumbling stone foundation of what had once belonged to the Marlowe family. And people in town still whispered about the Marlowes. They said the women in that family were witches. Back in the 1800s, the Marlowe women were known as healers. They delivered babies, treated fevers, and sold herbal remedies. But when crops failed or livestock died, neighbors always had someone to blame. Rumors spread of hex bags buried in fields, of strange marks carved into barn doors, of curses that left men blind or children sick. By 1892, the Marlowes were hated and feared. One night, the townsfolk gathered with torches. They dragged the last of the Marlowe women, Eudora Marlowe, from her home and accused her of cursing their land. They said she had given the witch's mark to their children, a black handprint that appeared on the skin before death. Eudora was beaten, tied to a tree, and left to die in the woods. Her last words, according to legend, were, "Every family that spilled my blood will bear my mark. Every child will feel it burn. You will never escape me." The next morning, the men who had tied her up were found dead in their beds. Their skin bore blackened handprints across their chests. That was 100 years before Darren Willis ever stepped foot on the land. He didn't know, or maybe he didn't care. To him, it was just cheap property with a view. The first sign came a week after he moved in. He was clearing brush near the ruins when he cut his arm on a rusted nail. The wound wasn't deep, but by morning the skin around it had darkened, almost like a bruise. Only it wasn't a bruise. It looked like the shape of a hand. Darren brushed it off. Infection, he thought. Nothing serious. But the mark didn't fade. In fact, it grew darker. By the third day, the handprint was black as soot, burned into his flesh. That night, he woke to the sound of whispering outside his cabin. A woman's voice. Low, angry. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped onto the porch. The woods were still. Silent. Too silent. Not even the crickets sang. And then, just for a second, he saw her. A woman standing in the trees. Her dress was torn, her hair tangled, her face hidden in shadow. But her hands were black, dripping like they'd been burned in fire. And she was pointing at him. The next morning, Darren drove into town, pale and shaking. He told a local man at the diner what he had seen. The old-timer just stared at him, then rolled up his sleeve. On his arm was the same mark, a black handprint burned into the skin. "Boy," the old man said, voice flat, "you're on Marlowe land. That ain't your mark. That's hers. And once she gives it to you, you don't shake it off." Darren tried everything. He scrubbed his skin raw. He went to doctors who said it was some kind of strange infection, but antibiotics did nothing. The mark only spread, up his arm, across his chest, burning hotter every night. And every night he saw her. Sometimes she stood at the edge of the woods, sometimes at his window. Once he swore he woke to find her standing right beside his bed, her blackened fingers hovering just above his chest. The smell of smoke clung to the room. By the second week, Darren was desperate. He tracked down an old woman in town, rumored to be a cunning woman, someone who knew the old ways. She listened quietly as he told his story, then shook her head. "You can't break the Marlowe curse," she whispered. "Not once it's laid on you. The witch's mark is a death sentence." "But there has to be something," Darren begged. The woman hesitated, then leaned close. "Bury yourself in consecrated ground. Sleep with iron under your bed. But it won't stop her. All you can do is delay her." Darren didn't sleep that night. He didn't eat. He sat in his cabin with a shotgun across his knees, waiting. The final night came 2 weeks later. A storm rolled across the mountains, lightning splitting the sky. Rain hammered the roof of Darren's cabin. He sat in the dark, staring at the handprint that now covered half his chest, glowing faintly in the flashes of lightning. And then he heard it, a knock on the door. Slow, heavy. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. Another knock. Then a woman's voice right outside. "You are mine." The door creaked open, though he hadn't touched it. The air grew cold, and the smell of smoke filled the cabin. She stepped inside. Eudora Marlowe. Her skin was gray, her eyes hollow pits. Her hands were black, dripping ash onto the wooden floor. She raised one hand and pressed it against Darren's chest. The mark seared like fire. He screamed, but no sound came out. His body convulsed as the blackness spread across his skin, covering him like tar. When the storm cleared the next morning, the cabin was silent. Darren was gone. All that remained was the handprint burned into the wall above his bed. Today, locals say the Marlowe, which still roams those woods. Sometimes hikers claim to see a woman in rags standing among the trees. Sometimes families wake with strange black bruises shaped like hands across their arms. They say the witch's mark never fades. Once she chooses you, you belong to her. And if you ever find yourself in the backwoods of Clay County, Kentucky, and you wake with a strange handprint burned into your skin, don't bother running. She's already touched you. That was the Appalachian witch's mark. Do you believe curses can really survive for centuries? Or are some places just too soaked in blood to ever heal? Until next time, don't take the wrong turn. The Appalachian Mountains are filled with ghost towns. Old mining communities abandoned after the coal ran out, their streets left empty, their houses collapsing back into the earth. Most of these towns are forgotten relics. But not Cold Creek. Cold Creek isn't just abandoned, it's cursed. The town sits in a hollow in West Virginia, so deep in the mountains that sunlight barely touches it. Founded in the late 1800s, Cold Creek was once a booming coal town with hundreds of miners, families, a church, a schoolhouse, and rows of company houses. But in 1924, everything changed. One night, a methane explosion ripped through the mine, killing 67 men underground. They say the blast shook the ground for miles, and when rescuers went down, the air was so hot it burned their lungs. Some of the bodies were never found. The mine closed, the company pulled out, and the families left. Within a year, Cold Creek was a ghost town. But people say the miners never really left. Flash forward to the 1970s. Two college students, Mark and Denise, were driving through West Virginia when their car broke down near the hollow. With no phone service and no towns nearby, they hiked down the trail and stumbled onto Cold Creek. By then, the place was already falling apart. The schoolhouse roof had caved in, weeds grew through the church steps, and the houses sagged like broken teeth. But here's the strange part. Mark swore he heard voices. Men's voices echoing underground. Picks hitting stone. The sound of a mine still working. Denise said she smelled smoke, sharp and acrid, even though nothing was burning. They only stayed a few minutes before running back to the road. By the time they returned with a tow truck, the path into the hollow was gone. Stories like theirs are common. Hikers say the trail shifts, as if the mountain itself is hiding the way. Those who do find it say the air inside the hollow is colder than anywhere else in the Appalachians. That's why they call it Cold Creek. In 1991, a local historian named Eleanor Briggs made it her mission to document ghost towns in West Virginia. She spent 3 nights camping in Cold Creek, keeping journals of what she experienced. The first night was quiet, but she noted an odd stillness. No crickets, no owls, no movement at all. Just silence. The second night, she wrote that she woke to the sound of boots marching outside her tent. When she unzipped it, she saw nothing. But in the dirt, fresh footprints appeared, one after another, walking past her. The third night was the last entry in her journal. Her handwriting grew frantic. I hear them digging. The ground is shaking. Something is coming up from the mine. I don't think they know they're dead. Eleanor never came back. Her tent was found shredded, her journal pages scattered, but her body was never recovered. Cold Creek became more than a ghost story after that. Paranormal groups began sneaking into the hollow. Some claimed to record EVP, muffled voices whispering, "Help us and get back." Others left shaking, refusing to speak about what they saw. One team in 2004 set up cameras inside the church. Around midnight, every candle they lit went out at once. The footage showed faint figures moving in the dark, shadows shaped like men, their faces obscured by soot. One by one, the cameras cut out. The crew abandoned their gear and never returned. But the most terrifying account comes from 2013, when a pair of hunters, Caleb and Jesse, wandered into Cold Creek by accident. They said the town looked almost alive, like the buildings had repaired themselves. The windows weren't broken, the doors weren't rotting. It looked like people still lived there. Then they heard it, singing, a low hymn, coming from the church. Against his better judgment, Caleb peeked inside. Dozens of men sat in the pews, their heads bowed, their skin gray and blistered as if they'd been burned. At the pulpit stood a preacher, but his face was just a blackened skull. The men all turned their heads toward Caleb at once. That's when he noticed. Their eyes glowed like hot coal. He slammed the door shut, and both men ran without stopping. When they looked back, the town was gone. Just trees and empty hillside. Locals say Cold Creek appears only to those who are marked. People who trespass too close to the mines. People whose bloodline ties back to the miners who died. Some believe the souls of those men are trapped, doomed to relive their final night in the hollow over and over. Others believe something else is keeping them there. Something darker than a mine collapse. Because in Eleanor Briggs's last journal entry, there's a line most people overlook. Written in shaky, smeared handwriting, it reads, "They're digging, but not for coal. They're digging their way out." If you ever find yourself in West Virginia, driving deep through the mountains, and you see an old path leading down into a hollow, don't follow it. And if you smell smoke where there is no fire, if you hear the clang of pickaxes in the dark, run. Because some towns don't die. Some towns wait. And Cold Creek is waiting for you. That was the ghost town of Cold Creek. Do you think towns can carry the memories of tragedy? Or is something much more sinister at work in places like this? The Appalachian Mountains are older than memory itself. The ridges stretch on forever, covered in mist and silence, holding secrets that go back long before people ever walked these hills. One of those secrets is the Shadow Man. Locals describe him as a tall, featureless figure. No face, no details, just a shape, darker than night, blacker than the deepest hollow. But unlike a normal shadow, this one moves on its own. It follows, it watches, and sometimes it takes. The first documented story of the Shadow Man comes from 1912 in eastern Kentucky. A farmer named Thomas Caldwell wrote in his diary that something was following him on his nightly walk home. He described it as a long shadow that stretched across the road even when there was no moonlight. The shadow, he said, moved against the wind, keeping perfect pace with him. One night, Thomas heard his name whispered, and when he turned, the shadow stood at the edge of the tree line, pointing at him. He never wrote another diary entry after that. A month later, his body was found hanging from a tree near the path. Locals swore there were no footprints in the snow around him, only a black stain where the shadow had been. Over the decades, stories of the Shadow Man spread across the Appalachian region. Campers, miners, and hunters all claim to see him, always in the same way, at dusk when the light dies and the woods grow silent. One hiker from North Carolina described it as, like watching nightfall take the shape of a man and step toward you. But the most chilling stories are the ones where the Shadow Man follows people home. In the 1950s, a family in southern Ohio reported strange happenings in their farmhouse. The father, George Matthews, said his children kept waking up screaming, claiming a tall shadow stood in their room. At first, George thought it was night terrors, but then he started seeing it too. Every evening, just as the last rays of sun dipped below the trees, a dark figure appeared at the edge of their property. It never came closer during daylight, but at night, it moved. The dogs refused to go outside. The windows rattled as if something pressed against them. And then, one night, George woke to find the figure standing inside his bedroom doorway. It didn't move. It didn't breathe. It just stood there. The next morning, George packed up his family and left the farmhouse forever. The building still stands, rotting in the woods. Locals call it the Shadow House, and they say the figure still lingers there. Paranormal investigators who have studied the legend say the Shadow Man isn't a ghost at all. Ghosts are the remnants of the dead. Shadows, however, belong to something else, something older. Some believe he is a guardian of the Appalachians, punishing those who trespass too deeply. Others think he's a predator, feeding on fear, following people until they break. Whatever the truth is, one thing is certain. Once you've seen him, you can never unsee him. One of the most disturbing modern encounters comes from 2008. A group of college friends were camping near the Blue Ridge Mountains. One of them, Lena, recorded a video diary of the trip. The first few clips are normal, laughing around the fire, hiking, cooking meals. But on the second night, her tone changes. She whispers into the camera that something is wrong. The woods are too quiet. No crickets, no owls, just silence. Then she flips the camera around, showing the tree line. There, between the trees, stands a figure, a shadow darker than the rest of the night, perfectly still. The footage cuts off. 3 of the friends return home. Lena didn't. Her body was never found. But that final clip leaked online years later. Paranormal experts call it one of the clearest pieces of evidence for the Shadow Man's existence. But what does he want? Witnesses say he never speaks, never rushes, never touches, until the final moment. Survivors claim that when he finally reaches you, you feel an overwhelming cold, a crushing pressure like the air itself is collapsing. And then you black out. Some wake up hours later, disoriented, with no memory of what happened. Others are never seen again. In 2017, a woman named Rachel was driving home along a lonely Appalachian backroad in West Virginia. It was just past midnight when her headlights caught a figure standing in the center of the road. Thinking it was a stranded motorist, she slowed down. But as her car approached, she realized the figure had no features. No clothes, no face, just a shadow. And then it stepped onto her hood. The engine died instantly. Her lights went out. The figure crouched low, pressing its faceless head against the windshield. Rachel described it as feeling like every ounce of warmth was being pulled out of her body. She screamed, and then suddenly it was gone. The car roared back to life. Rachel drove home shaking, but she claims the figure followed her. To this day, she sees him in mirrors, in doorways, even in her dreams. She believes he's waiting for the right moment to take her completely. The scariest part of this legend is that there are no rules to avoid the Shadow Man. He isn't tied to a place, like a haunted house or a curse mine. He follows you anywhere. Some say he's attracted to fear. Others say he chooses people at random, marking them for reasons no one can understand. But every story agrees on one thing. Once you see him, you're never safe again. So if you're hiking through the Appalachians and the woods suddenly go quiet, if the sun dips low and you see something move just at the corner of your vision, don't turn around. Don't acknowledge him, because the second you do, the Shadow Man knows your name. The Appalachian Mountains are filled with stories of spirits, strange lights, and shadowy creatures. But one of the most chilling legends isn't about ghosts or monsters. It's about the people, the witches of Appalachia. For centuries, whispers of witchcraft haunted these hills. Long before electricity reached the hollers, long before paved roads, settlers spoke of strange women who lived on the outskirts of town. They were said to heal the sick or curse the living. And one curse in particular has terrified Appalachians for generations. The story begins in the early 1800s in a remote settlement in Western Virginia, back when the frontier was still wild and unforgiving. A woman named Eliza Boone lived deep in the woods, far from the town. She was quiet, solitary, and always seemed to know more than she should. She grew herbs no one else had seen, and she whispered words and languages that didn't sound human. At first, townsfolk went to her for remedies. A tea for fever, a salve for infection, a charm for protection. And her cures worked. But when crops failed, when livestock sickened, when children died in their sleep, the townsfolk needed someone to blame. And they blamed Eliza. In the winter of 1823, they dragged her from her cabin and accused her of witchcraft. The town preacher declared her a servant of the devil. They tied her to a post, lit torches, and prepared to burn her alive. But before the flames touched her, Eliza spoke. She screamed a curse that chilled every man, woman, and child to their bones. This land is mine. These mountains are mine. And every soul who betrays me shall never know peace. Your children will hear my voice in the wind. Your kin will rot in the earth. And your bloodline will carry my shadow forever. They lit the fire anyway. Her screams carried through the holler. But the strange part was this. After her voice stopped, the flames burned blue. When the fire finally died, there was nothing left of her. No ash, no bones. Just a blackened circle in the snow that never melted. After that night, the town was never the same. The crops failed year after year. Babies were born sick. Livestock died without cause. And every family that had taken part in her execution suffered strange deaths. Some were found hanging from trees with no rope. Others drowned in shallow creeks, barely deep enough to cover their faces. The curse, it seemed, was real. By the mid-1800s, the town itself was abandoned. Families fled in fear, leaving homes to rot in the forest. But Eliza's curse followed them. One family who resettled in Kentucky reported hearing scratching on their cabin walls every night. They said Eliza's voice whispered through the cracks. "You can't escape me." Another family that moved to Ohio found their youngest daughter speaking in tongues she had never learned, muttering Eliza's final words in her sleep. And still, the deaths continued. Fast forward to the 20th century, and hikers began stumbling on the ruins of the original settlement in Virginia. All that remains now are stone foundations, a collapsed church, and the blackened circle where Eliza burned. Local hunters warn people not to step inside the circle. They say if you do, you'll hear her curse whispered in your ear. Some claim those who enter never leave the woods again. In 1979, a group of teenagers from Roanoke decided to test the legend. They hiked into the ruins and dared one another to stand inside the circle. Only 2 of them came back. They told police that their friends disappeared the moment they crossed the blackened ground. 1 second they were there, the next gone. No trace of the missing teens was ever found. To this day, the survivors refuse to talk about what they saw. But Eliza Boone isn't the only witch tied to these mountains. Throughout the Appalachians, there are dozens of stories of women accused of witchcraft, women who cursed the land as they died. Some curses remain bound to places, an old well, a church, a mine. Others seem to follow bloodlines, stretching through generations. One curse in Tennessee was said to turn every male heir of a family blind before the age of 21. Another in West Virginia doomed a family to drown in floods, one by one, over the course of a century. But none compare to Eliza's curse, because hers isn't limited to a family or a place. It's tied to the mountains themselves. In the early 2000s, a paranormal research team investigated the ruins of her settlement. They camped overnight, recording audio and video. At around 3 a.m., one of them reported hearing a woman crying in the woods. When they played back the recording, they didn't hear crying. They heard a woman's voice whispering clearly. "I warned you." The team packed up and never returned. Even today, hikers, hunters, and locals report strange encounters in that part of Virginia. Lights flicker in the forest with no source. Animals go silent. And sometimes, a woman's voice calls out from the trees. Those who hear it say, isn't a normal voice. It's layered, distorted, like 3 people speaking at once. And if you answer it, misfortune follows. So what does this curse mean for the Appalachians? Some believe Eliza became part of the land itself. Her soul soaked into the soil, the trees, the rivers. They say she isn't a ghost, but a force, a living curse woven into the mountains. Others think she was never just human to begin with, that she was part of something older, something tied to the earth long before settlers arrived. Whatever the truth is, one thing is certain. The Appalachian witch's curse is still alive. If you ever find yourself hiking in Western Virginia and you stumble upon the ruins of that lost settlement, remember this. Do not step into the circle of blackened ground. Do not answer the voice that calls your name. And if you feel the cold wind rise suddenly through the holler, run. Because Eliza Boone is still out there, and her curse never dies. The Appalachian Mountains are vast, wild, and unforgiving. They stretch over 2,000 miles, their hollers and ridges swallowing towns whole. But buried beneath the beauty of these mountains is a history of disappearances that cannot be explained. And the most chilling of them all are the children who vanish without a trace. The first story begins in the Great Smoky Mountains of Tennessee in 1969. 6-year-old Dennis Martin was camping with his family in a popular area called Spencefield. It was Father's Day weekend. Families gathered to hike, cook over fires, and enjoy the wilderness. That afternoon, Dennis was playing hide-and-seek with other children near the edge of the forest. He darted behind a bush, giggling, waiting to jump out and surprise his family. But when the other children finished counting, Dennis was gone. His father called his name. No answer. The family searched the woods until dark, their shouts echoing through the holler. Park rangers, FBI agents, and even Green Berets joined the search. For weeks, hundreds of people combed the forest, calling Dennis's name, checking every ravine, creek, and cave. But Dennis was never found. No clothes, no footprints, no bones. It was as if the woods had swallowed him whole. Over the decades, Dennis's disappearance became one of the most famous unsolved mysteries in Appalachian history. But here's the disturbing part. His case wasn't unique. In 1921, just outside Pine Mountain, Kentucky, four siblings vanished from their cabin while their parents were working in the fields. The mother returned at sundown to find dinner half prepared, a kettle still boiling on the stove, and the front door wide open. The children, ages 3 to 11, were gone. Search parties scoured the mountains for weeks. They found small footprints leading into the woods, but the tracks stopped suddenly at a creek bed, as if the children had simply vanished into thin air. Locals whispered that witches had taken them. Others said the mountains themselves had claimed their souls. The children were never seen again. Another case came in 1945 in Fayetteville, West Virginia. On Christmas Eve, the Sauter family's home burned to the ground. Inside were 10 children. When the fire was finally extinguished, only 5 bodies were found. The other 5 children were gone. Some believe they perished in the blaze, but investigators noted something strange. No bones were ever recovered from the ashes, even though bones should have survived the fire. Others reported seeing a strange woman watching the blaze from the woods. Some swore they spotted the children alive in the months that followed, traveling with strangers along the backroads of Appalachia. To this day, no one knows if they were kidnapped or taken by something far darker. Now, skeptics say these stories are tragedies, human errors, accidents in unforgiving terrain. But locals believe there's more. They believe the Appalachian wilderness is alive, and it takes what it wants. A retired park ranger once told a chilling story. In the 1980s, he was part of a search for a missing boy in North Carolina's Pisgah National Forest. The boy had wandered only a few yards ahead of his family on a trail. When his parents looked up, he was gone. The ranger said they tracked footprints leading up a slope, small bare feet in the mud. But then, suddenly the print stopped. Not faded, not washed away, just stopped, like the boy had been lifted into the air. The ranger admitted something he'd never written in his report. That night, he heard a child's laughter echoing through the trees. But when they shined their flashlights, the woods were empty. Many Appalachian locals tell similar tales of children spotted wandering the woods years after their disappearance, unchanged, looking the same age as the day they vanished. Of voices calling for help from caves or hollers, only to fade into silence when approached. And of strange figures watching from the tree line. Figures too tall, too thin, with faces blurred in shadow. One of the creepiest legends comes from eastern Kentucky, where old-timers speak of the lost children of the holler. They say these spirits are children taken by the mountains centuries ago. Their laughter can be heard on quiet nights, and if you follow the sound, you'll never come back. Hunters claim to have seen small handprints pressed into the mud along creeks where no children live for miles. And some swear they've seen pale faces peering from the darkness of caves, watching, waiting. But maybe the most disturbing part of all these stories is the pattern. The disappearances happen near the same places: creeks, caves, abandoned cabins, old mining shafts. It's as if something in the mountains is hunting, waiting for children to stray too far. Even today, new cases appear. In 2016, a 7-year-old boy vanished while camping with his family in the Cherokee National Forest in Tennessee. His father swore he only looked away for a minute. When he turned back, his son was gone. A search team brought in dogs, helicopters, and hundreds of volunteers. They found no trace, not even a shoe print. The boy was never found. Locals whispered the curse of the Appalachian children had struck again. So what's really happening here? Some say these are just accidents. The wilderness is dangerous, and children are vulnerable. But others believe in something darker. They say the mountains hide ancient spirits, witches, skinwalkers, or creatures we don't have names for, that lure children into the woods and keep them forever. Some think the children are offered as sacrifices, their spirits feeding something old that dwells deep within the earth. And others believe the children never die. They become part of the mountains, their laughter echoing forever through the hollers. If you ever hike in Appalachia, remember this. Keep your children close. Never ignore strange laughter in the woods. And if you see small footprints that lead into the forest and suddenly stop, turn around. Because in the Appalachian Mountains, children don't just go missing. They vanish. And sometimes they never really leave.